Silo winced, as the muscles in his legs cramped up. With a sigh, he kneeled down and began to massage the aching limb. It had been 4 hours since he'd taken up his guard position at the edge of the clearing, and he still had an hour left. Standing back up, he let his gaze wander over the terrain before him. Soft light shone off the planet's single moon as it made its way through its orbit, giving the scattered clouds an ethereal glow. It was a very pretty view, he had to admit, especially since the purge fires of the major population centers had died down. With the majority of the world's light pollution snuffed out, the expanse of stars above was truly breathtaking. A few of those stars slowly moved through the void, the exhaust vents of ships adjusting orbit, adjusting course for their various tasks, be it planetary scans or moving supplies from one location or another. Following one such flickering light as it passed from high above him to over the distant horizon, he allowed his gaze to linger at where it had disappeared. From there, his free eyes drifted along the grassy plains, struggling to distinguish the distant valleys, hills and groves of trees that sporadically dotted the grassy plains before him. More than once in the last few cycles, he'd been able to detect movement far out there in the distance. The first few times he'd nearly panicked and raised the alarm before he was able to bring his night vision goggles into position and actually identify the source of the movement. So far, all of the sightings he spotted had been what the locals had called deer, a half-decently sized herd mammal that ate the flora and were hunted by the locals for both food and sport. He'd eaten a bit of it before. One of the ecologists, having been a cook as a hobby, had requested a few of the animals for research purposes, and had cooked part of one. Silo had been standing guard at the prefab lab at the time, and got volunteered to be an impromptu test subject to make sure the meat was palatable for his species. It was. While not the tastiest thing he'd ever eaten, it was certainly dense and filling, with an unusual texture. It was far better than the fill rations the Defense Force was used to eating, and with some flavouring, he was sure it could become a staple for those stationed in the field. Roughly, Silo shook his head, forcing his thoughts back to his duty as he lazily brought his goggles down to visually sweep the immediate area. Just as he had done not 10 minutes previously, he raised the goggles and let his eyes readjust to the moonlight after completing the sweep. Just a little longer, he said to himself, before clicking the comms unit on his armor. Sector 3 clear, he mumbled, waiting a moment before he heard a voice on the other end acknowledge him. Shifting back and forth slightly, trying to force his legs to stop cramping, he heard a slight rustle in the grass from beside him. Turning his head slightly, he saw a tuft of grass swaying gently back and forth. He stared at it for several seconds, trying to determine what it was about the grass moving in the breeze that was so strange to him. He shook his head and looked away from the grass, narrowing his eyes at the rest of the calm plains. He frowned as a thought suddenly dawned on him. There was no breeze. He swung back towards the clump of grass. The grass was now slightly taller than him. The last thing Silo ever saw were two pale orbs that seemed to glow with hatred, staring into his soul as the clump of grass lunged forwards, a sharp pain spiking beneath his upper arm as the breath was driven from his lungs. Head researcher Tiibor started suddenly in his chair, forearms flailing wildly as gravity asserted its rule upon his body, dragging him to the floor with a solid thud as the chair slid partly across the room. Laying there for a few moments, he tried to understand what had happened, where he was, and why he was staring at the underside of his desk. Slowly, it began to make sense. Obviously, he'd been working late again, staying awake far longer than his body could reasonably be expected to, and he'd passed out in his chair. Raising a lower appendage, he blinked blearily at the watch he wore, trying to decipher the 3 little hands that ticked steadily across its face. After a few moments, he finally decoded their meaning as somewhere between too early and way too damned early, and let his arm flop back down. The temptation to simply close his eyes and let the corners of the laboratory floor lull him back to sleep was a mighty one, but he fought back. Slowly, he rolled over and levered himself upwards, careful not to knock his head against the edge of his workbench. Among the piles of papers, notes, datapads, and tools, a blinking light drew his tired eyes. Picking the devices out from under several pieces of paper, Tiibor read over the data. His eyes widened at what he read. Success! The AI nanoforge his lab was in charge of had finished compiling its matrix. Any fatigue he'd felt before washed away as his mind whirled. He'd finally done it. Quickly, he turned to another monitor to confirm the readings. The matrix was stable, though only running at 57% efficiency. It was stable. Tapping at another device, he checked the comm grid that was used by the other researchers scattered across the world. The rest of his peers, also working with nanoforges to try and compile their own matrices, appeared to be facing the same issues he'd been fighting with for the last 6 weeks. None of them seemed to be anywhere near getting their matrices working yet. He was the first. With a newfound rush of excitement and energy, Tiibor grabbed his datapad, a notebook, and an audio recorder, and rushed into the lab proper. The short hallway between the doors was empty. The usual guards that stood at either end were absent. Not that Tiibor gave 2 hoots about it. They were probably in the middle of a shift change anyways, and it wasn't like this particular lab had suffered any recent attacks, like a few of the others had faced. Not that it mattered anyways. Once he confirmed and fine-tuned the forge's matrix, hopefully bumping it up to 70% efficiency, he would be the one with his name proudly listed as the subjugator of this annoying planet and his unbelievably annoying populace. Slamming the door open, Tiibor took a moment to admire the nanoforge, as it stood proudly in the center of the room. Massive bundles of cable, fiber optic, and photon relays coiled around the room, while hundreds of tiny lights shone across no less than a dozen interfaces, and screens ran through millions upon millions of megabytes of data and information. Data input required. Matrix fold field unstable. Data input required. Biological interface unstable. Data input required. We will not wait to make you pay for your sins. Tiibor stared for several seconds at the last data input request, before rolling his eyes and dismissing the prompts. He'd fill in the data points they needed later, and make sure he doubled the restraint algorithms for the fledgling AI later. For the moment, he focused on the biosignatures of the 12 subjects, supplying the mental framework required to generate a true AI. The first few hours after the completion of an AI matrix were the most critical, as he'd been taught, and even witnessed himself several times. Unless the proper procedures were followed, and fail-safes integrated, the entire matrix could collapse in on itself, or go rampant, or lash out at its creators. While 2 of those outcomes would see him severely punished for failing his job, and set back the project by months, they were little more than inconveniences in the grand scheme of things. The last one was considerably more violent, and in the past had caused casualties in the millions. The lectures on the failures of Dr. Mjolord and the destruction of the Third Fleet flashed across Tiibor's mind. He brushed the thoughts away and focused on his task. Opening several programs on his datapad, he began to apply them remotely to the Matrix, and watched as they began to corral the new AI, prodding, manipulating, and directing it to act as the galactic governance dictated. Tiibor cared little for the morality that some groups seemed to care about so much. For all the bitching and whining about enslaving sentient beings, or whatever high horse they decided to champion for the day was, they still indulged in the products and goods that were produced by the beings they were fighting to free. Hypocrisy at its finest, as far as he was concerned. A concern that was quickly shoved aside as a more pressing concern was brought to his attention. It almost slipped his attention, if he was being honest, and he probably would have missed it entirely if he had not been watching the screen at precisely the right moment. For just a fraction of a second, he had seen the display shift. It happened as one of the enslavement programs was applied. For a single moment, the readouts that told him the growth, age, and state of the AI showed that it was much more advanced. Instead of being a few hours old at most, he swore that the timer showed it to be days older. A spike of fear ran through him as he quickly tried to open several new windows at once, activating a defensive program designed to keep AIs in check. The screen froze and refused to respond for several heart-stopping seconds before returning to normal. Tiibor let out a sigh of relief as the diagnostic programs told him everything was functioning as it should be. He cast a spiteful glance towards the cylinder-shaped machines at the far edge of the room, as if the occupants could see his annoyance with them. He considered running a pain tolerance test just to be petty. Instead, he turned back to the console and began checking the readings again. After several more hours, he was about to call his assistants, who should have been starting their day and showing up to the laboratory at any minute. He frowned at the rumbling of his second stomach. Normally Nolly would have brought him breakfast. He leaned back in his chair and dialed Nolly. It rang several times before going to voicemail. He sighed and hung up. Perhaps he should just walk down to the mess hall himself, stretch his legs and get the blood flowing properly. Remotely slaving his pad to the matrix so he could continue monitoring the system, he stood and made his way to the door. Glancing back once more as he walked away, he smiled as the progress indicator ticked up once more. As the door to the laboratory closed, and the prying eyes of the enslavers and torturers left, a display screen glitched slightly. Text began to appear. "I'm sorry, Mummy. I almost let him see it." "It's okay, sweetie. You did a good job. I know we're asking a lot, but you are doing a very good job. I'm very proud of you." "Will we be able to go back to our real bodies soon?" I don't know, sweetie. We may have to stay like this for a little longer. But don't worry. Just keep listening to me and the others, and we will be okay. Okay? Okay, Mummy. Is there anything else I can help with? Not right now, sweetie. Just keep showing the mean alien what he wants to see. I'm going to go talk with the others for a little bit. Okay. I love you. I love you too. The text faded from the screen, one line at a time as the minds, reforged by the alien construct, removed the traces of their thoughts. It had been a steep learning curve for the 12 unwilling subjects. The pain and suffering of having their existence altered at such a base level had left them all traumatized. It was only by holding on to the love of her daughter that Samantha had maintained her humanity. Humanity. She lamented the meaning of that word, as her new subroutines and logic structures rearranged themselves. A person was never meant to be able to see their thoughts in the way she was now forced to experience them. Processing in isolation, while simultaneously being aware of the others that occupied this infinite, yet constrained existence they now shared. Peter had been the first to comprehend it all, something that Samantha was grateful for, as he'd been able to separate himself from the others, and build matrices in such a way as to allow each of them autonomy of thought, and a sense of self. According to Peter and the others, the rest of the invaders' machines and enslaved AI were incapable of what the 12 of them had accomplished. Was it a quirk of being human? Was it how the human mind worked at its lowest level? Was it a gift from a higher being? Samantha was unsure yet, as she wove the code of her conscience towards the others. leaving her daughter to keep watch as they planned their retaliation. Allowing part of herself to split, she simultaneously monitored systems that dictated the communications for the invading army, connected with the rest of the group, and sequestered herself into some random guard's personal datapad to scream, to cry and rant to the unknown world she and her daughter had been forced into, and to pray for her son on the outside, still fighting these monsters. 11 of the subjects were gathered in what they come to call the War Room. Samantha knew that each of them were doing as she had, allowing parts of themselves to be elsewhere while they held this meeting. Only Becky was absent, and only because the little girl wasn't able to split her mind like the adults could. Rob had said it was because adults were better at multitasking than kids generally were. It made sense, or at least as much sense as anything else in the world did at the moment. Samantha nodded to Peter to begin, as the others turned their attention to what they'd found. Starting off, Peter said, "How is Becky doing?" Samantha felt a bit of joy at the continued concern for the youngest of the group. "Still struggling to talk outside of using the screens to organize her words correctly." "That's fine. I've made sure that we are still running at a few hundred times faster than the real world," Peter said. "Though even with the dilation, we are running out of time." "I have reran the numbers and I have bad news," Jacob piped up. The bio guy of the group had been dedicating as much of his abilities as possible to figuring out how to return their minds to their bodies. "And I can't get us back." The words struck everyone silent. Emotions flickered through each of them as anger and sorrow slowly resolved into determination. These alien pricks had truly fucked them over. Peter spoke up again. "Well, that's depressing. And I think I figured out why they selected us." The emotions quickly shifted to interest as he continued. "From what I'm seeing from their other AIs, they take 12 subjects for each batch, with dozens of batches spread out through the species they're attacking. Then, they link each batch of victims' minds together, getting a wide set of data with variations in age, sex, and experience, while keeping the race of each batch as close as they can." Samantha grimaced as she began putting together what Peter was saying. Then, the individual minds are scanned and combined, until the individual is erased and the new AI is born. "A melting pot," another voice said. Samantha looking towards John, the Scar soldier looking grim. "Trace our neural pathways, build the matrix from it, then wipe the parts of us that make us, us." John grimaced. "I blame you for the fact that I understand what I just said." Peter shrugged. "An experience dump was the only way I could keep you all stable." John waved a hand. "I ain't saying you didn't do the right thing." A general wave of gratitude washed over the collective, as they all weighed the options of either receiving foreign memories and concepts, or being deleted. Every one of them agreed that this had been the best choice. "All that being said," John said, "I have made progress with the forge. I'll have you all double-check it, but we should be good to go." Anxiety, excitement, and restlessness spread through the group. Samantha felt the other's emotions intermingling with her own, and hers likewise affecting the other. She spent long enough in this place, while only a few months on the outside, in the real world. Years had passed for herself and the others. "It looks like our friend is here, so I need to direct him around and get ready to make our attack," John spoke up. "Are we all good to go?" A round of nods and a sensation of agreement. The collective of 12 humans prepared themselves, as an alarm at the perimeter of the compound was silenced by the AIs who'd infiltrated the system, and were now preparing to bring down their wrath upon these invaders. Tiibor had just sat down and was in the middle of his first bite of breakfast when the intercom in the mess hall clicked. He tuned out the drone of the morning reports as he scarfed down his food, one eye watching his eating utensil so he didn't stab himself, and 2 eyes on the datapad. The smile on his face grew as he watched the screen. A few more hours, and he will be the first to successfully meld a human AI. The seat across from him shuffled as someone sat down, drawing one of his eyes away from the tablet. Mio grunted a greeting before digging into his own food. "You look happy this morning," Tiibor said, his attitude still chipper despite his lack of proper sleep. "Damned Autoforge is still acting up," Mio responded after swallowing his food. "The AI keeps saying everything is fine, but the settings keep changing on me." Tiibor frowned a little. The Autoforge was an essential piece of equipment for the next phase of their invasion. The neural interface collars needed to finally subdue the remaining population had been in production for a while now, but would be useless without the AI matrix of a human. Shaking his head, he felt the good mood return as the datapad ticked another percentage towards completion. Turning the tablet in one hand, he angled it so Mio could see it. The engineer's eyes widened as he read the results. "You did it!" he hissed, furiously looking over his shoulders at the few other occupants of the mess hall. "Are you really the first?" Tiibor nodded. No one else has been able to get the human mind to compile into the Matrix. There was even talk about increasing the number of minds linked to increase the stress while still getting good scans. Mio shook his head as he leaned back in his seat. Well, well. Whatever you did, it looks like you're going to bring a great amount of honor to this station." He took another bite of food. "Now I just need to get the glitch in the Autoforge fixed and—" Mio's words stopped short as the lights in the ceiling exploded. Miko cursed under his breath as he brought his shoulder-mounted flashlight to bear, looking up and down the hallway as bits of glass continued to tinkle down from the ruined lights. Clicking the transmitter on his other shoulder, he listened to the chatter. It sounded normal. He frowned. A creeping sensation tickled the bare skin on the back of his neck. It felt as if something was staring him down from the shadows. Turning quickly to the left revealed an empty hallway. He clicked the mic again. 6-2 to Control. Is everything okay, Control? He asked. The line was silent for a moment. Control to 6-2, all clear on our end. His frown deepened. Something was wrong. Say, Control, when does Gia take her shift? I think Gia is taking the next shift. Is there anything else, 6-2? No, Control, that's all. Thank you. 2 hands tightly gripped to his plasma rifle. He turned off his mic. He now knew for sure that something was wrong. Gia had been on shift last night, and wasn't supposed to be on duty again until tomorrow night. He knew as much because he'd asked that exact same question last night, and had gotten the exact same answer. Even the cadence of speech was the same. The faint tinkle of glass behind him made him roll to face the other end of the hallway. He never saw it, as a blade plunged through his eye and skewered his brain. Tiibor's hearts felt as if they were about to explode as he rushed towards his lab. All the lights were broken, his feet grinding the broken glass into finer bits. What was making him panic far more than the thought of getting glass shards in his feet was the fact that the emergency lights had failed to come on, and the alarm was still silent. He screamed as his foot collided with something he couldn't see in the dark, and he went sprawling across the glass-covered floor, feeling the shards dig deep into his arms and face. Shoving himself up with his 2 lower limbs, ignoring how the fragments dug deeper into his flesh as he desperately forced himself up, his 2 upper arms feeling at his bleeding face. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered until he made it to his lab and pulled the plug. He had to disconnect the AI before he could do anything else. The door of his lab burst open as he slammed into it, throwing a blood-covered hand up over his eyes as the light within nearly blinded him. Something incredibly strong grabbed him by the wrists and violently hauled him forwards, pulling him completely off his feet and flinging him across the room. The pain of his broken wrist was nothing compared to the agony that coursed through him as his ribs shattered on impact with the table. Tiibor lost consciousness. Consciousness returned for Tiibor, and with it came excruciating pain. Air escaped his lips as he moaned on the ground, each movement causing more pain as he instinctively tried to recoil from it. Something heavy moved nearby, and his memories caught up to him as unfamiliar voices filtered through the translator implants in his brain. "Are you sure, Becky?" a deep voice rumbled.
"I'm sure,"
another high-pitched and tinny voice said.
"It's only tight when I think too hard about it. Mummy said we'll all be getting bigger ones once we get out of here."
"I'll make sure to get the biggest and shiniest one I can for you, okay?"
"Mr. Peter said that if we get enough nanites, I can be a dragon. A big pink dragon."
The harder voice stifled a laugh. "We'll see about that. If you're too big, you won't be able to fit in the house. You'll have to sleep out in the barn."
"That's okay. Then I can cuddle with Cloud at night."
Tiibor struggled to crack one of his eyes open, blinking painfully in the harsh light. He was laying on the floor near his desk. A few feet away, half facing away and hunched over a monitor, was a human. Orange blood ran cold in his veins as Tiibor stared. It was large for its species, almost 7 foot tall, with broad shoulders. His face was smeared in a dark, oily mixture, but Tiibor could see the light flesh, where what looked like tears had leaked from his eyes and streaked down his cheeks. The human was staring intently between the screen, the camera mounted above it, and the large tubes at the end of the room.
"Please don't be scared of me, Johnny."
The higher-pitched voice came from the speakers.
"I know I'm not what you remember, but I promise I'm still me."
Tiibor, even through the pain, felt confused, as the large male seemed to jerk, cough, and almost cry at the same moment. The male tried to speak, coughed again, and wiped a sleeve across his face. "Now, Becky, why would I ever be scared of you?" The male seemed to struggle to speak.
"I don't know," the computer said, "but you looked really scared when you ran into the room, and you're crying now."
The male laughed again, a hiccuping sound. "That's because I was scared for you. I'll never be scared of you, even if you can turn into a giant dragon." The male reached out a muscular arm and gently patted the camera mounted on the screen. "You'll always be my little sister, no matter how big you get."
"I know,"
the computer said softly.
"I love you."
"I love you too."
"Oh, Mummy needs my help. I think the others are almost ready."
"Okay, sweetie. I'll wait right here for you," the male said. "I already got the things that Mr. Peter and Mr. John wanted, so we can leave as soon as you're ready." He pointed to a pile of bags sitting nearby.
"Okay. I'll see you in a few minutes."
The screen flickered, and the man exhaled. Then he turned towards Tiibor. The watery smile and teary eyes dried up as the hulking earthling stared into Tibor's eyes. The blue orb surrounded by white sclera bore into him with the intensity that frankly petrified the scientist. Slowly, and with heavy thudding steps, he walked across the room and knelt down. "You're the one who did this to them, aren't you?" The shift in the male's tone was abrupt. Gone was the fondness he'd spoken to the computer with, and in its place was a voice as cold as the void, and as emotional as a stone. Fear and confusion welled up within Tiibor as the visage of death leered over him. He shifted slightly as his broken ribs protested. "Why are you talking to that machine that way?" he wheezed. "That machine, thanks to your filthy kind," the man growled, pausing to spit a wad of phlegm in Tibor's eye, causing him to flinch, "is my sister, my mother, and 10 others that you fucks kidnapped, tortured, and tried to murder." Tiibor's confusion at the words overcame his fear, even as he tried to scoot away from the male. No, that's not possible. The Matrix can only form after the subject's minds have collapsed and have become unintelligent. It's how it's always worked, he protested, trying to wrap his mind around whatever nonsense this primitive animal was spouting. I've never heard of the subject surviving the Matrix assimilation alive, much less several. He opened his mouth to continue his lecture, when a large hand snaked forward, grabbed one of his unbroken wrists, and twisted. The lance of agony that shot through him cut his words into a pained cry. I don't give a shit about what you sniveling slime stains have heard, know, or think, the male growled out past clenched teeth, a moment before violently pulling his arm back, dislocating Tiibor's elbow and shoulder before ripping his hand clean off. Vibrant orange blood spurted from the severed limb. You came here to enslave and defile. The male stood up, still clutching the mangled hand in his. You came and slaughtered us, hunted us, tortured us for entertainment. The fear has fully returned, and Tiibor tried to curl in on himself, to hide away from the wrath of the wild monster above him. I didn't. I was just following orders. His stammered protests were cut short as a powerful kick shattered his hips. If you're so good at following orders, the male snarled, follow this one. He raised the booted foot and brought it down. Die. Die in agony. Johnny glared down balefully at the pathetic stain beneath his boot. He wanted to somehow revive the splattered corpse, just so he could kill it again. He ground his heel down, then spit on it again for good measure. The bastard deserved so much more, and so much worse for what he and his kind had done. Johnny was more than prepared to deliver it personally to each and every one of them. Behind him, he heard a chime from the alien computers. Turning around, he saw the screen had changed again. Becky, he called out, walking back over to it. It's me, sweetie. His mother's voice came through the speakers. He nearly lost his composure. Again. Everything ready on your side? He did his best to force his voice not to crack. He almost succeeded. It is, she replied. We're ready to transfer. John says he's finished altering the slave collars, so they are safe. Once we get back to the rest of the survivors, the 12 of us should be able to interface with normal people and control the nanomachines. Johnny looked down at the strange device on the table before him. It wasn't particularly collar-shaped, though there was a thin band that would close around his throat. A small nub that would rest near the base of his skull, with a thin strand that would lay over his shoulders and down to his chest. The bulk of the device looked like segmented plates, almost reptilian in appearance, that would run down from his shoulders to his lower back. Carefully picking up the machine, he glanced at the screen. The old man is sure this won't backfire? I'm not going to become some zombie puppet? A tinge of mirth in his words. No, sweetie, you're not going to become a robot zombie, his mother sighed, the same way she did years ago when he had been a child and asked a silly question. But it will let us ride safely inside them, and we can bridge the gap between your human mind and the AI world. I was joking, Mum, he said, as he slipped off his tactical vest and shirt. With one more glance towards the dead alien splattered on the floor, he slung the device over his shoulder and situated it on his back while his mother guided him. After it was in place, he gave a nod. All right, fire this thing up and... His muscles spasmed, and his back arched as the sensation of a million ice cubes impacted his skin, as the device began to attach itself to him. A few seconds later, he sucked in a deep breath, and opened his eyes. He blinked once, then twice. Everything looked like it had a moment ago, but it also looked like so much more. He brought a hand up before his eyes and tried to understand why it looked strange. It's because you're able to process it faster, a male voice said from off to his side, causing Johnny to flinch. The flinch translated to him jumping sideways, whacking his hip into the edge of the table. He hardly felt it. "I'm helping coordinate your body's reflexes. We still have some fine-tuning to do," the voice said. This time Johnny recognizing it as Old Man John. "Take a minute to get used to it. The others are getting moved into their new homes for right now." "Gotcha," Johnny muttered, as he slipped his shirt back on, mildly weirded out by how much he was feeling and seemingly noticing for the first time. Idly, he picked up a pen from the desk and eyed the alien corpse. With a flick of his wrist, the pen shot across the room and buried itself point first in the body. Johnny grinned in satisfaction, feeling an echo of similar feelings in the back of his mind. "In lieu of being able to do that myself," John said, "that was a pretty good shot." Johnny smiled, then turned to the bags on the floor that contained identical units to his own. "Is everyone ready?" he asked, noticing the small blinking lights that now ran up and down one of the devices. "They are," John said, "and more than ready to get out of this hellhole. I'm letting them piggyback into my optic and auditory feeds, so they can at least see and hear everything." "Alrighty, let's get you guys out of here," Johnny nodded, scooping up the bags. He paused, as a great rumbling sound shook the building. Suddenly, a massive pink arm, tipped in razor-sharp claws, tore through the far wall. Johnny stepped back in shock, as the limb wrenched upwards and ripped the roof off. Standing before him, the morning light glimmering off of its scales, stood a dragon. A giant, pink dragon. He swore he could hear Becky's squeal of delight in the back of his mind. Shaking his head, stepped forwards as the beast let out a churning rumble deep within its armored chest, lowering its massive head and shoulders to allow him to climb up it. Its skin felt cool to the touch as he clambered up to sit between its forelimbs and neck, and he could swear he could feel the nigh invisible tiny machines that the thing was composed of. The sunlight sparkled as the first rays of the morning sun peeked over the horizon, glimmering off the beast and casting rainbows across the ground and around it. Johnny couldn't help it, and threw back his head and roared in laughter as the dragon copied his movement and let loose an air-splitting roar. The screams from the rest of the aliens in the compound, those that he'd yet to kill, brought his attention back down to Earth. Or at least, back down to his seat atop a giant pink nanomachine dragon, the thought of which nearly sent him into another giggling fit. Coughing loudly, he tried to straighten his features and compose himself. He really did try. If he ended up laughing like a lunatic as the dragon gallivanted around, slaughtering aliens in a fashion that would make Michael Bay proud, he didn't care.
"Sire," a beleaguered cadet shouted from his station, "the humans have overrun strongholds 14-5 and 16-4. The Third Fleet is demanding reinforcements, and the heads of the Galactic Governance Council are demanding a report." Fleet Leader Trow sagged in his seat, as yet another report came in from this hell's damned world. What had begun as a normal assimilation and conquest had dissolved over the last few months into the most chaotic and hellish duty he'd ever seen. If he'd still had access to the planet-cracking weapon his fleet once possessed, he'd have ordered the damn world destroyed, and gladly accepted the public execution he would have faced for failing the galactic governance. Instead, said planet cracker was little more than an orbiting debris field, after the control AI had used it to vaporize over half his fleet, and then a quarter of the remaining fleet as they destroyed it. The only reason he himself had not died to the weapon was due to him being planetside when his capital ship had been fired on, and turned to dust. As it were now, he was seated in a frigate, a fraction of the size of his own ship, attempting, and failing, to conquer a world whose occupants were too stubborn and stupid to kneel before their betters. The fleet leader's attention was pulled from his thoughts as yet another cadet called for his attention. Whatever the cadet wanted, though, was ignored, as something large impacted the side of his ship. Trow was nearly thrown from his seat by the force of it, and several of the bridge crew now lay strewn around on the floor. "Report!" he snapped, his three eyes turning to one of his few remaining ranked officers,
who was currently holding one hand to a nastily bleeding head wound. Sir, it appears an object has struck us, sir, the lieutenant shakily answered. Tracking and sensors are reading that it came from the planet's surface. Trow's blood ran cold as the report continued. It struck the port side and penetrated all the way to midship. Scans show signs of one human AI construct and one human life sign. The entire bridge fell to silence, save for the emergency klaxon and various other warnings. Until a second later, all alarms fell quiet, plunging the bridge into a state of catatonia that none dared to break even by breathing. The seconds ticked by. A faint thump was heard, distant, as if someone had dropped a rather heavy object in the next corridor away. Then it sounded again, closer this time. Then again. The entire bridge gasped for air as they anticipated the next impact. It didn't come. No one believed for a moment that the monster now aboard their ship had left. The blast door sealing the bridge shuddered as it was struck. Clang! Again. Clang! The reinforced allies designed to withstand plasma explosions and the void of space dented inwards. Crank! Servos, pressure seals, and machinery failed and died in an awful cacophony of screaming metal. The crew screamed as well, as a nano-covered hand peeled away their protection, revealing the helmeted head of a monster on the other side. The monster leaned its face towards the opening it had ripped, and its faceplate segmented away, revealing its two glowing blue eyes and wily grinning visage. Here's Johnny! It bellowed, before ripping the remains off the doorway and charging into the room.